Thank you for the introduction, Nancy. So I'm going to be setting the scene by presenting some work that I did with one of my really wonderful PhD students, Hannah Robinson, who I know is lurking in the background there. And also she is the one who made these beautiful slides. I could not do as good a job as her by a long shot. So I thought I'd start, as I'm the first speaker, about why we're really interested in menstrual disposal, and also in the case of the work we've done, looking at reasons for different types of menstrual washing and drying. So the first one, and I'm sure we're all really familiar with this, is the technical side of things, is that often people are putting used menstrual materials down toilets, whether that be into a septic system or a latrine pit or a sewer system, where we're then having downstream issues with the technology, for example. We're also seeing that, particularly in the last decade or so, there's been such a big push to get people who menstruate everywhere access to menstrual products. But I say products because it generally has been disposable products, which has then had the actual disposal mechanism as a bit of an afterthought. It's been about the access and not about what happens later on. So we're having increased environmental pollution from all of this extra menstrual waste. And then something I'm sure all of us are aware of working in the menstrual health space, menstrual status, and that in general, people knowing about your menstruation, and particularly if they know about it because you have leaked and they've seen your menstrual fluid in some way, can be a really upsetting, and it can sometimes be dangerous for people. I give this example here of this young girl who committed suicide after being shamed about her period. And obviously, if you have used menstrual materials or you have washed your menstrual materials and people see them, then people do know what your menstrual status is. So it's really important that we're actually looking beyond just access and what happens afterwards. And then from a personal perspective, about 5 years ago, I was on the committee developing the international standard for non-sewered sanitation systems. Can someone turn off their mic? Thanks, sorry. And these non-sewered sanitation systems, essentially these were the gates, reinvent the toilet challenge toilets that were in people's houses. And it had been decided that the systems didn't need to be able to treat menstrual waste beyond menstrual fluid. And I agreed with that, but I said, you know, we need to make sure that if these toilets that are in households are not going to need plumbers regularly, and they're only going to be serviced once every 6 months or a year or 2 years, that if people do actually flush products down the toilet, households can fix that themselves so that the toilet's not decommissioned for a year or whatever. And the response from other members of the committee was, don't worry, we'll put a sticker on them that says, don't flush things. And that really made me quite annoyed because I think we all know on this call that it's not just about education. I really felt that we needed to have a way that these systems, if something was flushed, for example, it could be removed relatively easily. And I could see this was just a slow moving car wreck, essentially. And I was overruled in that, you know, we won't put anything more in the standard. And some of you might know me. I put the logo in the corner around Shit Happens and the Wash Failures Initiative. I felt like we were kind of flagging something really early on to address in terms of this menstrual waste issue, but I really wasn't getting any ground there. And that's when I decided that we know there are issues, there's got to be evidence out there. Let's do a study where we pull together all of the existing evidence on why people dispose of or wash their menstrual materials in a certain way, so that we can then inform the designers of what it is that they need to be considering. And so that is the systematic review that Hannah and I did. We ended up with 80 studies, and we had a lot more in low and lower middle income countries than we did in high and upper middle income countries. It's quite interesting because we have seen a lot around fatbergs and people flushing menstrual products and baby wipes and things in high income countries. But the solution to that seems to have been, we'll put signs on the door rather than look at why people are doing it. In terms of what we did see, mostly in lower and low or middle income countries, we were looking at studies that were evaluations of interventions. So often where an NGO was providing girls in school generally with menstrual products, and research papers on knowledge, attitudes and practices in particular regions. And we only included them if they had both what the practice for washing or disposal was and a reason given for why that was practiced. We did see that there were a lot more girls than women represented in the studies, as you might have seen from Julie Hennigan's review from low and middle income countries on menstrual experiences, and then our review in high income countries. We do see a lot more research done with girls in low income countries and women in higher income countries, because that's kind of where the programmatic focus is in those two different locations. So not to bore you anymore with the methods there, we found that there were 3 groupings of behavioural drivers which were really important in why people behaved in certain ways when it came to disposing and washing and drying menstrual materials. So the first was the state of available facilities, and physical infrastructure was important. You know, was there actually a toilet there, a bin there if that's what people needed, somewhere to wash pads, for example. But also these facilities, what it really drove behaviour was the social perceptions of them. So, for example, was there a lock on the door? So it was a private facility. Was there separate boys and girls toilets so the boys couldn't see what you were doing with your menstrual materials? And then in almost as many studies, we saw that menstrual taboos and social stigma really influenced behaviours. So cultural beliefs around what was, the proper way of washing or disposing of products. We saw embarrassment and worry, so these unpleasant emotions and some shame around people knowing what you're doing or seeing what you're doing. And then we saw fear as well. And we thought it was important to separate this out, because this was people who were actually scared because they felt that there was a threat of danger or pain or something else that could harm them. So, for example, the one that's often talked about is, if people find out I have my period, they will think I'm having sex, and therefore I might get beaten for that. And then we did find that in 14 of the studies out of 80, a lack of knowledge was a driver of the behaviours that people chose to engage in. So it definitely is a driver in some cases, but not as much of an influence as those advocating for stickers on doors would have us believe. And as you can see, because there is overlap clearly in terms of how many studies we saw different drivers in, we wanted to just elaborate on some examples where we actually saw mixtures of these different drivers. So, for example, in a couple of studies, we saw that girls hadn't been taught how to dispose of materials properly, but they were also too shy to ask people because of the stigma around menstruation. And so then they were just throwing their waste in the bushes or on the beach or wherever, away from where they were. And we also saw an example where a fully functional incinerator was installed out of school, but it wasn't actually installed adjacent to the girls' toilets. So the girls would have to take their used menstrual materials with them out of the toilet across the school to put them in the incinerator. So even though the engineers had achieved, like, they built a great incinerator, and even when these girls might have thought that incineration was a perfectly fine option for disposal, that step in between where a lot of people could find out their menstrual status was what stopped them actually using it. So essentially, what the word we're trying to get out from this work for designers, engineers, people who are actually building these facilities, is you have to make sure that you're actually considering all 3 of these drivers, and you need to be considering them in context. You can't just assume that one country will be the same as another, or even different districts or different schools. You need to make sure that for the users you're designing for, you think about all 3 of these things. And finally, just what Hannah and I have done, this is a journal article that you can access, it's open access, but we've also created this summary, which is just 1 page back and front, giving a brief idea of the results, but most importantly, this red box on the front, which is the recommendation of what we really think that anyone who is thinking of designing menstrual disposal or washing facilities needs to have front of mind. And we were hoping that would be useful for some of you in terms of actually going to donors or going to just other people in your organisation and saying, well, let's make sure that we incorporate this going forward. It's my 10 minutes up. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the speakers.